Eine kleine Nachtmusik was a subtitle, and I think Mozart meant from that a short night music, kind of a notturno. In Mozart's time, these titles, serenade, cassation, divertimento, Feldparty, Tafelmusik, Finalparty, those were simply used not very precisely, but for some of them there was some designation. For instance, a notturno was played around 11 p.m. late at night, whereas a serenade would be played earlier in the evening. For most 18th century composers, their work in palaces, working for the aristocracy, this type of music was something that they had to do on a daily basis. Composers worked very hard during this time. They would get up very early in the morning. From morning to late afternoon, they would be composing music, rehearsing, teaching, doing administrative work, writing meticulous letters to all kinds of people, and they need to be using a very bureaucratic language. So this was a lot of work, and yet for the evening after dinner, for their bosses, for the nobility who didn't do much work anyway, they would have to put up a concert. And those concerts could include symphonies, concertos, or they could also include works like serenades, divertimentos, cassation. This type of works, though, the serenades, divertimento, cassation, notturno, they would be written almost for one-time use, just for that day, and they were not expected to be around or performed again. So we are fortunate in a sense that about 30 of Mozart's works in this category that is meant to be a diversion, an entertainment for the nobility, has survived to our day. So this particular serenade is his K525. So when you go to concerts or listen to the recordings on the radio, you often hear these K numbers. Those are catalog numbers, but K stands for a botanist who categorized and kept a ongoing list of Mozart's works. His name was Kerhel, and that's why it is called K525. And there's something interesting about this. It's for those of us who are interested in mathematics. Any K number in Mozart's repertoire, Mozart's works above 100, you can actually, if you know the K number, you can actually figure out his age. And take, for instance, this particular serenade, Eine kleine Nachtmusik, which is K525. So divide 525 by 25. So we end up with 21. Add to that 10, we end up with 31. And that was exactly the age that Mozart wrote Eine kleine Nachtmusik. So the formula is any number over 100, divide by 25, and then add 10, and it will give you most of the time pretty accurately the age of Mozart when he wrote this. So in this case, Mozart's Serenade was written in 1787, and we really don't know why it was written, what was the occasion. It could have been something that he wrote for a special commission for some large amount of money, because it was a busy period, and this is a fairly elaborate work. When Mozart made a Mozart kept his own catalog, and he entered this piece in his catalog. And when he entered in this catalog, he actually wrote down all the movements. And from that, we know that a particular minuet and trio is missing. And it was never found. So at the moment, the work is survived to this day, and it is one of the most popular works for any string orchestra or any string quartet, because it can also be played with a string quartet. But it is most likely, judging from the construction of the piece, the elaborate opening, it was probably meant to be played by a chamber orchestra, by a string orchestra. And during 18th century, there was no such thing as a set number of players per part. Usually few players per part, per first violin, per second violin, sometimes two, three would be. And the idea was really more of a improvisation. So find whoever is available to play. So things were a whole lot less formal than they are today in terms of orchestral life is concerned. Um, so the Eine kleine Nachtmusik is a amazing work. The first movement is an Allegro, and it begins with strings in unison, and it's a symmetrical couple of statements, and then comes the typical Mozartian suave melodies. The second movement is a romance. So the title of Serenade for 18th century audiences still carried this romantic notion of a musician standing under the balcony of or the window of a lady and playing a serenade or singing a serenade. So it's a romance, and very much like in any romance, there is a bit of hesitation initially. So we have these two eighth notes in the violins beginning the hesitation, two eighth notes hesitantly before a declaration of a melody or a declaration of love. So it's a beautiful moment, but even here, there is a moment where Mozart throws this sinister pattern of three notes between violins and cello and contrabass. But then it goes back to the opening, beautiful opening melody. The minuet is typical, very robust, very energetic minuet, which follows with a trio section. Trio section is absolutely beautiful. Here, the first violin is playing this most beautiful eight notes, beautiful melody, and underneath we have second violins just murmuring, pianissimo, very light, and we have some accentuations from cello and contrabass from the bass line. The last movement is a fast, it's a rondo, and it's full of Mozartian humor, Mozartian wit, and it sounds very much like a very smart conversation going on in a group of people. There are a lot of dialogues. Tchaikovsky's third string quartet, Opus 30, is an amazing work. Tchaikovsky was a composer that was always insecure about himself. At the time when he was writing this piece, he was also enjoying some success from his Swan Lake and his first piano concerto, which are works today, are amazing works, and they're very popular. They are Swan Lake is absolutely one of the most popular ballet suites, and also first piano concerto is probably one of the most played piano concertos. In spite of that, Tchaikovsky was very insecure, never felt comfortable, very timid, and very insecure of his own talents. He actually heard the premiere performance of this string quartet, the third string quartet, in the home of Nikolai Rubinstein, famous Russian pianist and conductor. And in the third movement, the third movement is a marche funèbre. It's a funeral march, and at the end, audience basically was crying, and he noticed that. In spite of that, he writes a letter to his brother, who confided a lot in Modeste. Modeste was his brother's name, and Tchaikovsky addressed him as Modia. And he tells Modia that he's running out of ideas, and that he's repeating himself, and he's not terribly happy with himself as a composer, as an artist. Tchaikovsky wrote this work shortly after his very close friend, a Czech cellist, Ferdinand Laub, who he met while teaching at Moscow Conservatory. Ferdinand Laub was a colleague. He played in some of the premieres of his previous string quartets, and he died 1 year before this work was written. So Tchaikovsky began this work while in Paris and finished it in Moscow. And then it was premiered in Rubinstein's house. The first movement of the work starts immediately with some grief. So there is this first violin and later the cello line where Tchaikovsky is basically singing his heart out. And then this slow introduction connects to a faster section that is in 3/4 time. But this is a amazing section, because here we have just about everything. Everything that is in Russian psyche, from grief to happiness and energy and tremendous amount of passion. The movement concludes when the grieving section returns, goes back to the beginning material, and then comes a second movement, which is daylight difference. Here you can almost see Tchaikovsky referring to this brilliant cellist Ferdinand Laub, of his life and his humor, wit and humor, because it's almost like a comic opera. Here we have this sudden explosions of loud eighth notes that go around from instrument to instrument, and they are preceded by very quiet and murmuring 16 notes, bubbling, staccato, short, springing 16 notes. And there is a beautiful viola solo that later on is repeated by the first violin section in this movement, but it's a short movement. And then comes the centerpiece of the piece, the incredible third movement, the funeral march. And like in many traditional funeral marches, repeated notes is as in Chopin a funeral march, or even Beethoven's Seventh Symphony, the second movement, the funeral march theme, 8 notes, repeated 8 notes, and then comes a tremendous passionate first violin solo that again later on is taken by the cello as well. You can hear here the march, the funeral march, and occasionally someone in the march is crying because he writes this B flats, the single note in the second violins, and he's playing rhythmic games here to create the crying sound of a person on the violin, and it is a absolutely beautiful moment. The fourth movement is a bright allegro, very Russian folk song like movement, beautiful energetic movement with some beautiful contrasting melodies and dynamics, and it is an absolutely gorgeous movement. To me, the third string quartet is a complete masterpiece, and Tchaikovsky wrote so much music, and so much of that music is mainstream repertoire that it is easy to miss, to underplay some of the works. Considering that Tchaikovsky wrote only 8 works of chamber music, every one of them are absolutely beautiful. At Sinfonia Toronto, we have played all 3 string quartets. He has written 3 string quartets. And the Souvenir de Florence, the sextet, string sextet, which we played in chamber orchestra form. And of course, we have played many times his Serenade. His Serenade is a total masterpiece. But this string quartet, in a way, stands on its own as far as I am concerned, because it is so Russian. Even Souvenir de Florence, where he writes under the influence of Italy, but even there is some Russian overtones. But in this movement, to understand this movement and to play well as a performer, one really needs to know the Russian psyche. So it's a challenging work. It is as national in character as, I would say, Brahms's music. Much of Brahms's music is very Germanic in character. So these 2 beautiful masterworks, Mozart's Eine kleine Nachtmusik and the third string quartet, are for this program of live to be